First of all, I want to tell you that I had gender dysphoria as a child. So I understand the issues here. I still, on some level, manage my gender dysphoria. I never transitioned medically, but as a child I did everything I could to present as a male. And so I do have some personal history with this and personal understanding. I've also done a lot of research since this issue came up because I've been really concerned with the idea that young children would have to have their gender identity affirmed rather than get help for gender dysphoria. So I wanted to talk about the different causes of gender dysphoria, and there are many. Most people think that gender identity is fixed. Transgender activists have done a good job of convincing society that somebody is born with their gender identity, that a boy can be born in a girl's body and vice versa, and that gender is assigned at birth. Sex is not assigned at birth, it's recorded. The trans activists have done a great job of suggesting that it is assigned, that it's somehow not something that is empirical and observable. There are a very small number of people who are born intersex, and they have ambiguous genitalia, and for those individuals, a gender or a sex may be assigned, or a doctor may choose to wait until they can run further tests to determine what the actual sex of that person is. But for the vast majority of the population, sex is recorded at birth. It's not assigned. Gender is something that develops over time. Gender identity, like political identity and religious identity, is formed through experiences and how somebody internalizes themselves, and it is not fixed. So people who suggest that a therapist affirms the gender identity of a child is suggesting that the gender identity is fixed, and it's not. So there are a number of causes of gender dysphoria, and I want to go through them because I don't think most people understand that gender dysphoria can be caused by a number of different things. The first one I want to talk about is autogynephilia. Autogynephilia is actually more of a sexual orientation. Someone with a man, it's actually strictly men who have this, are sexually attracted to themselves, to the idea of them being female. It's a sexual turn-on for them to imagine themselves as being a woman. So they do everything they can to turn themselves into the woman that they are turned on by. Again, this is a sexual orientation, and it's probably not something we want to encourage in young children because young children are too young to be sexually active. So if a child has autogynephilia, we probably don't want to encourage that a whole lot in younger years. And it might be very helpful for a child like this to go to a therapist and have the therapist help them understand their autogynephilia. There's something called rapid onset gender dysphoria. Rapid onset gender dysphoria is a fairly new phenomenon. It seems to happen in clusters. Lisa Lippman did some research, and it appears to be a social contagion. The idea is that one girl in a peer group seems to have some gender dysphoric feelings, oftentimes because her body starts to change during puberty, and those changes are uncomfortable for her. Perhaps she's always identified more as being a tomboy, perhaps she's always had more male friends. Perhaps she just doesn't fit into traditional female roles. So she starts to experience gender dysphoria and announces that she is transgender. And suddenly, a number of other girls within the peer group develop gender dysphoria. It's important to talk about this because the transition from childhood to puberty can be really tough for girls as their bodies start to change and as social expectations change. These kids can often be very adamant about their gender dysphoria because it's part of being accepted in their peer group. There is a growing concern that children who appear to be gay or lesbian as young children are sometimes either internalized homophobia or homophobic within their family or community, decide that they're going to be transgender. Because if they present as the opposite gender, then they're not actually homosexual. So it's more socially acceptable. Some girls have internalized misogyny, and this isn't surprising. Girls' bodies are objectified and sexualized. So there are girls who are very uncomfortable with their body when they become teenagers and develop gender dysphoria as a result of societal messages about it not being good to be a female. There are children who develop gender dysphoria as a result of sexual assault. If you're sexually assaulted as a child, kind of a magical thinking process that happens is, if I transition and become the opposite gender, if I say I'm a boy and not a girl, then I won't be vulnerable to being sexually assaulted. And believe it or not, this happens to boys too. If a boy is sexually assaulted, that boy might decide to present as a girl because they will find themselves, they feel less vulnerable because they were sexually assaulted as a boy. So sexual assault can cause gender dysphoria. Rates of children on the autism spectrum who are referred to gender clinics is incredibly high. So kids who are on the spectrum, they have a hard time negotiating social interactions, and it's not surprising that they might decide that they are the opposite gender if they are gender nonconforming. Especially a girl who has Asperger's or autism, who doesn't fit at all with expected social norms of what it means to be a female, it would make a lot of sense that they would decide that they're male. There are instances where kids get mixed messages or get confused about something. There was an example I heard of where a child decided that they wanted to be a different gender because recently a new baby had been brought home and the baby had a lot of special needs, and the child thought if they became the same sex as the baby, that their parents would pay more attention to them. Weird kind of misunderstandings like this can happen a lot. There are situations where parents obviously prefer one sex over the other, in which case a child might decide that they're transgender so that they can get the attention and approval of their parents. And then there are instances where parents just provide mixed messages, or a child totally misunderstands what's going on and therefore decides that they want to be a different gender. So there are all different reasons why a child might develop gender dysphoria. In all of these cases, if the child is affirmed that their symptom is actually fact, that they actually are something that they're not, that is going to make their mental health worse, not better. In fact, there are a lot of people who are coming out now who transitioned thinking that their gender dysphoria would resolve if they transitioned, and they found that it didn't, because the gender dysphoria is a symptom of an underlying issue. In my case, my gender dysphoria morphed into anorexia when I was a teenager, and this makes sense because anorexia and gender dysphoria are both a sense of being uncomfortable within your body. Therapists can help alleviate that discomfort and help children manage and resolve those feelings, but if their gender dysphoria is affirmed, they will never have the opportunity to manage and understand why it is that they have gender dysphoria. So what is the big deal? Some people might say, just go ahead and affirm the kid, and then if they outgrow it, they outgrow it. What's the big deal? And here's the big deal. First of all, it's a lie. A boy cannot be born in a girl's body, and a girl cannot be born in a boy's body. And if we tell children that that can happen, we are going to confuse them. We are telling them something that is biologically wrong. Another issue is that when children start to transition, they're more likely to medical transition. They're more likely to start on puberty blockers when they're as young as 8 years old. They're more likely to start on cross-gender hormones at the age of 14. They're more likely to get mastectomies when they're 14 to 16 years old and get bottom surgery, which is having genitals changed to match the gender that somebody feels they are. We don't know the long-term consequences of these kinds of medical transitioning. We don't have any longitudinal studies on what happens to children when they're put on puberty blockers, when their natural puberty is actually stopped and they're put on cross-gender hormones. We don't know what that does to a body. We have no longitudinal studies because this is a new thing. These children are guinea pigs. And when we are looking at short-term studies, we're finding out that these cross-gender hormones do have long-term and significant side effects. These children often become sterile. They are unable to have children of their own. And it also affirms their dysphoria. So if this dysphoria is a result of an underlying issue, rather than dealing with that issue, it pushes them further into dysphoric feelings, into feelings like there's something wrong with them. One of the things that frustrates me the most about the suggestion that children transition is the idea that all they have to do is take on traditional gender stereotypes of the opposite gender, and that's how they transition. And that just reinforces stereotypes. It's suggesting that a boy can be a girl if that boy starts dressing like a girl and doing really traditional girl activities and calls themselves a girl. they're suggesting that these gender stereotypes that we have tried to push away from and try to say it's okay to be gender nonconforming, that these gender stereotypes now define us. Gender dysphoria is caused by many different things. It isn't just one thing. It isn't just one thing, and we can't treat it as such. Second, it can be a symptom of something of a very big issue, an underlying issue that needs psychiatric help. If a child for whom gender dysphoria is an underlying issue doesn't get the kind of therapy that they need to address that underlying issue, their mental health is going to suffer. We're talking about children from the age of 2 to the age of 18. Now, when someone's an adult and they want to transition, that's their choice. But what about me when I was 5 years old and sexually assaulted and developed gender dysphoria? Should I have been affirmed? No. I needed mental health services. So I wanted to talk a little bit, really quickly, about what gender dysphoria actually feels like. Because people will say, well, you're born in the wrong body. And at least for me, what it felt like was a deep sense of disconnect with my body and a deep sense of self-hatred. I hated my body. I felt like if my body were different, everything in my life would be better. And so if you affirm a child who has gender dysphoria and say, yes, actually, you are the other gender, you are in the wrong body, what you're doing is actually you're actually encouraging that self-hatred. You're encouraging body shaming. It's really encouraging to think about themselves as if their body is wrong. This is not something therapists do. Therapists do not affirm delusional and dysfunctional thinking. Therapists try to help people manage those thoughts. And they can be managed. We have lots of good therapeutic techniques to help manage gender dysphoria that do not require a child to transition. These issues are incredibly complicated. I have the greatest compassion for children who have gender dysphoria because I know what it feels like. I know how uncomfortable it is. I know how it's impossible to find peace when you have those feelings of dysphoria. And the reason that I'm talking about it is I want to expand the conversation. We need to do more research. We need to expand how we're thinking about this issue. We need to identify why is it that these children are developing gender dysphoria. There are a number of different causes of gender dysphoria, and I'm sure some of them I haven't even touched on here because each person has a different story. Each person has a different experience. And one thing that's happened to me is since I've started talking out about my gender dysphoria, I've had trans activists be quite rude to me and say, well, you were never transgender. And that's exactly the point. I was never transgender. I had gender dysphoria. And just because someone has gender dysphoria does not mean that they are transgender. That's the point. Because if we transition all children who have gender dysphoria, and if we affirm their gender confusion, we're basically saying that we are accepting that they are transgender. And likely they're not. Likely they're not.